The blood hadn't even dried on the emergency room floor when Dr. Marcus Holloway pointed his finger directly at Sarah Bennett's face and said the words that would haunt him forever. "You're nothing but a glorified waitress in scrubs." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet nurse standing before him had already pulled 17 soldiers back from death's door in places where one wrong move meant coming home in a flag-draped box. And when that military helicopter touched down on the roof of Riverside Memorial Hospital, 3 weeks later, carrying a dying officer whose wounds looked impossible to survive, every arrogant doctor in that building was about to learn exactly who Sarah Bennett really was. Before we dive into this story, I want to invite you to stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will shock you. If you're enjoying this, please like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and your support means everything. The fluorescent lights in Riverside Memorial Hospital's emergency department had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had bothered to fix them. Sarah Bennett noticed because she noticed everything: the burned-out bulb in Bay 4, the loose wheel on the crash cart, the way Dr. Marcus Holloway's jaw tightened whenever she entered a room. She'd been at Riverside for exactly 19 days, and in those 19 days she'd learned that being invisible was sometimes the safest way to survive. "Bennett, we need fresh linen in trauma too," a senior nurse barked without looking up from her clipboard. "And someone left a mess in the supply closet. Handle it." Sarah nodded and moved. She always moved. Silent, efficient, forgettable. That's what they wanted, so that's what she gave them. The other nurses had stopped trying to include her in their lunch breaks after the first week. The residents treated her like furniture, and the attending physicians, especially Holloway, acted like her presence was an inconvenience they had to tolerate due to staffing shortages. Riverside Memorial sat in the heart of Crescent Falls, a mid-sized city that prided itself on its medical facilities but suffered from constant understaffing. Sarah had arrived in early October with nothing but a weathered canvas bag, a studio apartment lease, and a nursing license that checked all the right boxes. Her references were immaculate. Her skills assessment had been flawless. Her interview had gone smoothly enough that HR pushed her paperwork through in record time. What her file didn't mention, what she'd made sure it wouldn't mention, was where she'd learned to insert a chest tube in 45 seconds, or why her hands never shook when someone was bleeding out in front of her. "Excuse me, Nurse Bennett?" Sarah turned to find a young woman in blue scrubs holding a tablet, looking uncertain. "Yes? I'm Amy Chen. Sorry, Amy Rodriguez." The woman laughed nervously. "Still getting used to the married name. I started last month in the ICU, and I heard you worked trauma before transferring here. I was wondering if you had any advice for—" "Bennett," Dr. Holloway's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "Are you on break, or are you working?" Amy flinched. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Working, doctor." "Then perhaps you could prioritize patient care over socializing." Holloway didn't wait for a response before disappearing into the physician's lounge, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. Amy's face flushed red. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble." "You didn't," Sarah said quietly. "Don't worry about it." But as Amy hurried away, Sarah felt the familiar weight settle in her chest. The same weight she'd been carrying since she left the military. The same weight that made her wonder, late at night in her empty apartment, whether coming to Crescent Falls had been a mistake. The problem with Riverside Memorial wasn't the building or the equipment or even the patient load. The problem was the hierarchy, and the hierarchy at Riverside was carved in stone. Doctors at the top, senior nurses just below, everyone else fighting for scraps of recognition. And Sarah, quiet, unassuming Sarah, who kept her head down and her past locked away, had landed at the very bottom. Dr. Marcus Holloway had made sure of that. Holloway was 42, brilliant, and fully aware of both facts. He'd graduated top of his class from a prestigious medical school, completed his residency at a Level 1 trauma center, and spent the last 8 years building Riverside's emergency department into something he could brag about at conferences. He had sharp features, prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished, and a voice that could drop the temperature in a room by 10 degrees. He also had an ego the size of Texas and a pathological need to remind everyone that he was the smartest person in the building. Sarah had realized this on her 3rd day when she'd quietly pointed out that a patient in Bay 6 was showing early signs of compartment syndrome. Holloway had stared at her like she'd just suggested treating a broken leg with crystals and positive thinking. "I've been practicing emergency medicine for over a decade," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think I know compartment syndrome when I see it." The patient had been in surgery 4 hours later, and Holloway never mentioned it again. Since then, Sarah had learned to keep her observations to herself unless absolutely necessary. She documented everything meticulously, followed protocols to the letter, and stayed out of Holloway's way. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. She'd seen what happened to nurses who challenged him. They got the worst shifts, the most difficult patients, and eventually they left. Sarah had already left too many places. She didn't want to leave another. The afternoon of November 3rd started like any other shift. Sarah arrived at 2:50 for her 3 o'clock start time, changed into clean scrubs, and checked the assignment board. Trauma bay coverage. Again. It was always trauma bay coverage because none of the other nurses wanted it, and Sarah never complained. "Hey, Bennett." One of the senior nurses, Kelly something, Sarah could never remember her last name, leaned against the break room counter with a coffee that smelled like it had been sitting there since morning. "You're covering trauma 1 and 2 tonight. We've got a full moon, so expect the crazies." Sarah had never bought into the full moon theory, but she nodded anyway. "Got it." "Oh, and Holloway's in a mood, so maybe just stay invisible, yeah?" As if she had a choice. The first 5 hours passed in the usual chaos. A kid with a broken arm from skateboarding, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be anxiety, a construction worker who'd stapled his own thumb and wanted someone to remove the staple. Routine cases that Sarah handled with quiet efficiency while the residents took credit and Holloway swooped in for the interesting cases. At 8:17, everything changed. The radio crackled first. "Riverside Memorial, this is Medic 12 en route with multiple trauma from MVA on Highway 41. ETA 4 minutes. We've got at least 6 critical, possible more. Repeat, multiple critical inbound." The charge nurse's voice boomed through the department. "All available personnel to trauma bays. We've got a mass casualty event incoming." Sarah was already moving. She'd heard those words before. Different voices, different languages, different circumstances, but the response was always the same. Move faster. Think clearer. Don't freeze. The first ambulance screamed into the bay at 8:21, followed by 3 more in rapid succession. The accident had involved 2 cars and a commercial truck on a rain-slick highway. The carnage was extensive. "Female, mid-20s, unresponsive, GCS3, a paramedic shouted as they rushed a gurney past Sarah. "Massive head trauma, pupils fixed and dilated." "Trauma 1, Holloway barked. "Bennett, you're assisting. Move." Sarah moved. The patient was young, maybe 24, with blonde hair matted in blood and a face so swollen it barely looked human. Holloway started calling orders immediately, and Sarah executed them without hesitation. IV access. Monitors, intubation equipment ready. She'd done this 100 times, though never in a hospital this clean, this well-lit, this safe. But something was wrong. Sarah saw it in the way the patient's abdomen was distending, the way her blood pressure kept dropping despite the fluids they were pushing. She'd seen this exact presentation before, in a forward operating base in a place she tried not to think about, when a young soldier had been brought in after an IED blast. "Doctor," Sarah said quietly, "I think she has internal bleeding. We should get a fast exam, Chua." "I'm aware of the differential diagnosis, Nurse Bennett," Holloway snapped without looking at her. "Focus on your job." Sarah bit back her response and focused, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The patient's pressure dropped again, then again. The monitors started alarming, and Holloway ordered more fluids, more pressors, more everything except the one thing Sarah knew they needed. "Doctor, her abdomen. I said I'm handling it." The patient coded at 8:47. Sarah started compressions while Holloway barked orders and residents scrambled. They got her back after 3 minutes, but her pressure was still tanking. Finally, Holloway ordered the ultrasound. The screen showed exactly what Sarah had known it would show. Massive internal bleeding. The patient needed surgery immediately. "Get her upstairs now," Holloway shouted. "Why wasn't this caught sooner?" Nobody answered because everyone knew better than to point out the obvious. Sarah stepped back as they rushed the patient toward the elevators, her hands aching from compressions, her mind screaming with frustration. The girl survived. Barely. Surgery found a lacerated spleen and 2 liters of blood in her abdomen. If they'd waited another 10 minutes, she would have died. Sarah thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it got worse. 2 days later, Sarah was called into the nursing supervisor's office. She knew something was wrong when she saw Holloway sitting there, looking smug. "Ms. Bennett," the supervisor said, her voice carefully neutral, "there's been a concern raised about your performance during the mass casualty event on November 3rd. Sarah's stomach dropped. "What kind of concern?" Holloway leaned forward. "You repeatedly questioned my medical judgment in front of staff and delayed critical interventions by insisting on unnecessary tests. Your behavior was insubordinate and potentially dangerous." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's not what happened. I suggested a fast exam because the patient was showing signs of—" "You're a nurse," Holloway interrupted, his voice cold. "You don't diagnose, you don't make clinical decisions, you follow orders. And if you can't understand that basic concept, perhaps you're in the wrong profession." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "Dr. Holloway has submitted a formal incident report. I need to hear your side." Sarah could feel the trap closing. If she defended herself too strongly, she'd be labeled difficult. If she stayed silent, the report would stand unchallenged. She'd seen this play out before in different contexts, different power structures. The outcome was always the same. "I was trying to help the patient," Sarah said finally. "That's all." "By undermining the attending physician?" Holloway's eyebrow arched. "That's your definition of helping?" The meeting ended with a written warning in Sarah's file and a stern reminder about staying in her lane. Holloway left looking satisfied. Sarah left feeling like she'd just lost a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. That night, she sat alone in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m, staring at a cup of coffee she didn't want. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a monitor was alarming. Her reflection in the dark window looked tired and small. Maybe she should just quit. Pack up her apartment, find another city, another hospital, another fresh start. She'd done it before. She could do it again. Her phone buzzed, a text from Amy Rodriguez, the ICU nurse who'd tried to talk to her that day in the hallway. "Heard what happened. That's BS and everyone knows it. You saved that girl's life." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, but didn't respond. Kind words didn't change anything. They never did. She was gathering her things to leave when the building shook. Not violently, just a low rumble that rattled the windows and made the lights flicker. Sarah looked up, confused, as other staff members rushed to the windows. "What the hell is that?" someone shouted. The rumble grew louder, deeper, accompanied by a rhythmic thumping that Sarah recognized instantly. Her body recognized it before her brain did, every muscle tensing with a response that had been trained into her over years. Helicopter. But not just any helicopter. The sound was too heavy, too powerful. Military. Sarah reached the window in time to see it descending toward the hospital's rooftop helipad. A massive Blackhawk, dark against the night sky, running lights cutting through the darkness. Her heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. "Since when do we get military transports?" a resident muttered beside her. "Must be serious," someone else said. The PA system crackled to life. "All trauma personnel to the emergency department. Repeat, all trauma personnel to ED immediately. This is not a drill." Sarah was already running. Her mind had shifted into a different mode, one she'd tried to leave behind but never quite could. She knew that sound. She knew what it meant. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that everything was about to change. The ED erupted into controlled chaos. Holloway was barking orders, residents were scrambling, and nurses were prepping trauma bays like they were preparing for war. Which, Sarah thought grimly, maybe they were. "What do we know?" Holloway demanded. The charge nurse looked pale. "Military transport incoming with critical trauma. Single patient. That's all they'd tell us." "Single patient?" Holloway looked incredulous. "They sent a Blackhawk for one person?" Before anyone could answer, the elevator doors opened and everything stopped. The men who stepped out weren't paramedics. They were soldiers. Full combat gear, weapons, serious faces that scanned the room with professional assessment. Behind them came the gurney, and behind the gurney came more soldiers, and behind them came 2 people in suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Where's your trauma attending?" the lead soldier asked. His voice carried authority that made Holloway's usual commanding tone sound like a suggestion. I'm Dr. Marcus Holloway, Chief of Emergency Medicine, Holloway said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. What do we have? Colonel James Mitchell, age 47, multiple penetrating trauma from classified operation. He's critical and unstable. We need your best team on this immediately. They wheeled the gurney into Trauma 1, and Sarah got her first look at the patient. Her breath caught. The colonel was barely conscious, his face gray beneath the oxygen mask, his uniform cut away to reveal damage that made the MVA cases look like paper cuts. Shrapnel wounds, burns, bleeding from multiple sites. His vitals were crashing, and even from across the room, Sarah could see the distinctive pattern of blast injuries she'd seen too many times before. Everyone not essential, out, Holloway ordered. I need a senior surgical resident, 2 experienced nurses, and I'm staying, Sarah heard herself say. Holloway's head whipped around. Excuse me? I said I'm staying. You need someone who knows blast trauma. The words came out steady, calm, despite the fact that Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs. You're on my list, Bennett, which means you're assisting from the sidelines. Do not overstep. The next 30 minutes became a nightmare. Holloway tried standard trauma protocols, but nothing worked. The colonel's pressure kept dropping. Bleeding wouldn't stop. The monitor screamed warnings that everyone was trying to ignore. We're losing him, a resident said, voice cracking. No, we're not, Holloway snapped. Push more blood. Get surgery down here. Someone page. He's got blast lung, Sarah said quietly. The room went still. Holloway turned to her with an expression that could have melted steel. What did you just say? His breathing pattern, the subcutaneous emphysema, the way he's responding to ventilation, it's blast lung. Standard protocols won't work. You need to adjust your strategy or he's going to die in the next 5 minutes. I don't recall asking for your medical opinion, Nurse Bennett. I'm not giving you an opinion, Sarah said, and something in her voice made several people look up. I'm telling you what I know. And I know blast trauma. Holloway's face went red. You don't know anything. You're a floor nurse who got lucky once with a differential diagnosis. You don't make calls in my trauma bay. You don't question my judgment, and you sure as hell don't. The monitor flatlined. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah saw the resident freeze, saw Holloway's expression shift from anger to panic, saw the soldiers at the door tense like they were preparing to witness a failure. And something inside Sarah, something she'd kept locked away for 3 years, finally broke free. She stepped to the table. Start compressions, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. Someone get me a 14-gauge needle and prepare for a chest decompression. Now. You don't have the authority, Holloway started. Then watch him die. Sarah's eyes locked with his, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside Memorial, she didn't look away. Your choice, Doctor. The room held its breath. The monitor kept flatlined. The colonel kept dying. And then Holloway stepped back. What happened next would be talked about at Riverside Memorial for years. Sarah Bennett, quiet, overlooked, underestimated Sarah Bennett, took control of that trauma bay like she'd been born to it. Her hands moved with precision that came from muscle memory, earned in places where hesitation meant death. Her voice stayed calm while everyone around her was falling apart. She called for procedures that most civilian nurses had never heard of and executed them with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 50 times before. Needle decompression, adjusted ventilator settings, specialized blood product ratios, techniques that weren't in standard emergency protocols but were gospel in forward surgical teams. Where did you learn this? A resident whispered, watching in awe. Sarah didn't answer. She was too focused on the monitor, on the colonel's chest rising and falling, on the slow, impossible climb of his blood pressure from critical to unstable to barely stable. At 9:53, the colonel's heart rhythm normalized. At 9:57, his pressure held steady. At 10:02, he was stable enough to transfer to the ICU. The trauma bay fell silent, except for the steady beep of monitors. Sarah stepped back from the table, her scrubs covered in blood, her hands finally starting to shake now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked up and found everyone staring at her, including the soldiers at the door whose expressions had shifted from concern to something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. Or realization. One of them stepped forward, a lieutenant colonel based on his insignia. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, then at the name tag on her scrubs, then back at her face. Bennett, he said slowly. Sarah Bennett. You served with the 75th Combat Support Hospital, didn't you? The room went very, very quiet. Sarah felt every eye in the trauma bay lock onto her. She saw Holloway's expression shift from shock to confusion. She saw the residents exchanging glances, trying to figure out what they'd just missed. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The lieutenant colonel smiled, a small, knowing smile. Yes, you do. You were with the Rapid Response Surgical Team. Afghanistan, right? I saw you work once at Bagram. You saved 3 soldiers in a firefight while the base was under attack. He turned to address the room. This nurse has more combat trauma experience than most military surgeons. She's the real deal. Sarah felt the walls closing in. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. The questions, the attention, the past. She'd worked so hard to escape. But before she could formulate a response, one of the men in suits pushed into the room. We need to clear this area, he said, his voice brooking no argument. This patient and this incident are classified. Everyone who was in this room will need to sign non-disclosure agreements and— Wait, Holloway said, finding his voice. What just happened here? Who is this patient? And how does she— He pointed at Sarah. No classified military procedures? The suit's expression didn't change. Those questions are above your clearance level, Doctor. What I can tell you is that Colonel Mitchell is alive because of exceptional medical intervention, and the United States military is grateful. Beyond that, this conversation is over. But the conversation wasn't over. Sarah could feel it in the way people were looking at her, in the whispers that had already started, in the lieutenant colonel's knowing smile. Her secret was out. The quiet nurse who kept her head down and followed orders had just revealed herself to be something else entirely. And as she left the trauma bay on shaking legs, she knew with absolute certainty that her life at Riverside Memorial would never be the same. Behind her, Holloway stood frozen, his world suddenly much smaller than it had been an hour ago. The nurse he'd humiliated, dismissed, and tried to destroy had just done something he couldn't do. And the look on his face suggested he knew exactly what that meant. The hospital had gone quiet in that strange way that happens after major trauma. Sarah walked through empty hallways, past darkened patient rooms, her blood-stained scrubs leaving a trail she'd have to explain later. She made it to the locker room before her legs gave out. Sitting on the cold tile floor, back against the metal lockers, Sarah Bennett, formerly Sergeant Sarah Bennett, 75th Combat Support Hospital, veteran of 2 deployments and more casualties than she could count, finally let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. She'd saved the colonel's life. She'd exposed her past. She'd challenged Holloway in front of everyone. And tomorrow, when the sun came up and the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, she had no idea what would be waiting for her. The only thing she knew for certain was that hiding was no longer an option. The quiet nurse everyone had underestimated had just shown them exactly who she was. And somewhere in the hospital, in an ICU bed under military guard, Colonel James Mitchell was breathing because of her. The question now was whether that truth would save her or destroy her. The answer came at 6:43 the next morning when Sarah's phone started ringing before her alarm went off. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the colonel's gray face, heard the flatline, felt her hands moving through procedures she'd sworn she'd never use again. When she finally gave up on sleep at 5:30, she'd sat at her kitchen table drinking instant coffee and staring at the wall, waiting for whatever came next. The caller ID showed Riverside Memorial's main line. Bennett, she answered, her voice rough from exhaustion. Ms. Bennett, this is Karen Whitmore from Human Resources. I need you to come to the administrative offices before your shift today. 8 o'clock sharp. Sarah's stomach clenched. What's this about? I'm not at liberty to discuss it over the phone. 8 o'clock, Ms. Bennett. Don't be late. The line went dead. Sarah sat there holding her phone, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle over her shoulders. She'd been fired before, or strongly encouraged to resign, which amounted to the same thing. The military had taught her how to save lives, but civilian hospitals had taught her that saving lives didn't always save your job. She arrived at 7:45, dressed in clean scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face carefully neutral. The administrative wing of Riverside Memorial was a different world from the emergency department. Carpeted hallways, framed artwork, the smell of fresh coffee instead of disinfectant. Sarah had never been called here before. That fact alone told her everything she needed to know. The waiting area outside HR was empty except for one other person. Dr. Marcus Holloway sat in one of the chairs, looking like he hadn't slept either. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, wrinkled shirt, tie loose, dark circles under his eyes. When Sarah entered, his head snapped up, and for a moment, raw hostility flashed across his face before he managed to control it. Neither of them spoke. Sarah sat 3 chairs away and waited. At exactly 8 o'clock, Karen Whitmore emerged from her office. She was a severe woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. "Dr. Holloway, Miss Bennett, please come in." The office was uncomfortably small for 3 people. Sarah took the chair farthest from Holloway while Whitmore settled behind her desk and opened a thick folder. "I'll get straight to the point," Whitmore said. "Last night's incident has created a complicated situation. We've been contacted by both military liaisons and hospital administration regarding the events in Trauma 1. I need to understand exactly what happened." "What happened," Holloway said before Sarah could respond, "is that Nurse Bennett violated protocols, exceeded her scope of practice, and created a dangerous situation by—" "Dr. Holloway," Whitmore interrupted, her voice cold. "I didn't ask for your editorial. I asked for facts." Holloway's mouth snapped shut, but his jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Whitmore turned to Sarah. "Ms. Bennett, your personnel file indicates you transferred here from Seattle Grace Hospital. Before that, there's a 3-year gap in your employment history. Would you care to explain that gap?" Sarah had prepared for this question years ago. "I was traveling, taking time off to deal with personal matters." "Personal matters that somehow gave you advanced combat trauma training?" The room went quiet. Sarah could feel Holloway staring at her, could sense his confusion shifting into something else. Anger, maybe. Or fear. "I served as a military nurse," Sarah said finally. "I don't usually discuss it because it's not relevant to my current position." "Not relevant?" Whitmore's eyebrow arched. "You saved a colonel's life last night using techniques that Dr. Holloway, our chief of emergency medicine, wasn't familiar with." "I'd say that's extremely relevant." Holloway made a sound like he'd been punched. "That's not—" "I was handling the situation appropriately. She interfered with—" "You were losing the patient," Sarah said quietly. "Everyone in that room knew it. How dare you?" "Enough." Whitmore's voice cut through the rising tension like a scalpel. "I have statements from 3 witnesses, 2 residents, and a senior nurse, all confirming that Ms. Bennett's intervention stabilized the patient when standard protocols were failing. I also have a message from the military liaison stating that Colonel Mitchell is alive specifically because of Ms. Bennett's actions." She looked at Holloway. "Do you dispute those facts?" Holloway's face had gone pale. "I dispute the characterization that I was losing the patient. I was in the process of— the monitor flatlined, Marcus." Whitmore used his first name like a weapon. "According to the documentation, Ms. Bennett took control of the situation after the patient coded. Are you telling me that's inaccurate?" The silence stretched long enough that Sarah could hear the wall clock ticking. Holloway's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "No," he said finally. "That's accurate." Whitmore nodded and closed the folder. "Then here's what's going to happen. The military has requested that both of you sign non-disclosure agreements regarding Colonel Mitchell's identity and the circumstances of his injury. That's non-negotiable. Additionally, they've requested that Ms. Bennett be made available for consultation during the Colonel's recovery period should complications arise." Sarah blinked. "Consultation? Apparently your expertise in blast trauma is considered valuable." Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "The hospital administration has agreed. You'll maintain your regular duties, but you'll also serve as a specialist resource for this case." Holloway looked like he'd swallowed acid. "This is unprecedented. She's not qualified to—" "She kept a patient alive when you couldn't," Whitmore said flatly. "I'd say that qualifies her for something, unless you'd like to explain to the hospital board why we should refuse a request from the United States military." Holloway said nothing. His expression had shifted from anger to something darker, something calculating. Sarah recognized that look. She'd seen it before on people who'd been publicly challenged and were planning their revenge. The meeting ended with both of them signing documents that Sarah barely read. Her mind was spinning too fast to focus on the legal language. As they left Whitmore's office, Holloway walked ahead without acknowledging her existence, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled rage. Sarah made it halfway down the hallway before she heard her name. "Bennett, wait!" She turned to find Amy Rodriguez hurrying after her, looking excited and nervous in equal measure. "Oh my God, is it true? Did you really save that military guy's life?" "I can't talk about it," Sarah said. "I signed an NDA." Right, of course." Amy glanced around to make sure they were alone. "But people are talking. They're saying you did this emergency procedure that nobody here has ever seen before, and that you used to be in the military, and that Holloway completely froze while you took over." "Amy, I'm not gossiping, I swear. I just wanted to say that it's amazing. Everyone thinks so." "Well, not everyone. Holloway's friends are being weird about it. But most people are saying it's incredible." Sarah felt exhaustion pulling at her. "I just did my job." "Yeah, but—" Amy hesitated. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you ever tell anyone you had military experience? That's kind of a big deal." The question hung in the air between them. Sarah could have deflected, could have said something vague about privacy or moving on. Instead, she heard herself say, "Because I didn't want to be defined by it. I wanted to be a good nurse, not the military nurse. There's a difference." Amy's expression softened. "I get that. But maybe sometimes people need to know who you really are, so they don't underestimate you." After Amy left, Sarah stood alone in the corridor, thinking about those words. Don't underestimate you. The problem was that being underestimated had been her shield. It had kept her safe, kept her invisible, kept her past where it belonged, buried and forgotten. Now that shield was gone, and she had no idea what would happen next. Her shift started at 9, and within the first hour, Sarah understood that everything had changed. Nurses who'd barely spoken to her before suddenly wanted to chat. Residents asked for her input on cases. Even the attending physicians, the ones who weren't in Holloway's inner circle, treated her differently, more respectfully, more carefully. But it wasn't respect Sarah saw in their eyes. It was curiosity mixed with caution, the way people look at something familiar that suddenly revealed itself to be dangerous. Around noon, she was restocking supplies in Trauma 2 when she heard voices in the hallway. Holloway's voice, low and sharp, and another voice responding in placating tones. "Don't care what the administration says," Holloway was saying. "She violated every protocol in the book. If we start letting nurses override physician judgment based on some military background, we might as well throw our medical hierarchy out the window. Marcus, I understand your concern, but the patient lived. That has to count for something." The patient would have lived with proper protocol. She got lucky, and now everyone's treating her like some kind of hero when she's nothing but a liability waiting to happen. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, hidden from view, but close enough to hear every word. "Look," the other voice said. Sarah recognized it now as Dr. Philip Chen, one of the senior physicians who'd always been decent to her. "I know this is complicated for you, but maybe instead of fighting it, you could work with her. Use her expertise as a resource." "Work with her?" Holloway's laugh was bitter. "She undermined me in front of my staff, Philip. She made me look incompetent. You want me to smile and pretend that's acceptable? I want you to remember that we're here to save lives, not protect egos." Silence. Then Holloway's voice, colder than Sarah had ever heard it. "My ego isn't the problem here. The problem is a nurse who thinks 3 years playing soldier makes her qualified to practice medicine. And if this hospital won't address that problem, then maybe I need to address it myself." Footsteps retreated down the hallway. Sarah waited until she was sure they were gone before stepping out of the trauma bay, her hands shaking. The threat had been clear. Holloway wasn't going to accept what had happened. He was going to fight back, and Sarah had no illusions about who would win that fight. He had seniority, connections, and the full weight of the medical establishment behind him. She had a secret past and a reputation for being quiet. The afternoon brought more changes. Sarah was called to the ICU to check on Colonel Mitchell. 2 armed soldiers stood outside his room, and a man in a dark suit intercepted her before she could enter. "Ms. Bennett? I'm Agent Morse, Department of Defense. I need to speak with you about the Colonel's care." They found an empty conference room. Morse was in his 40s, clean-cut, with the kind of neutral expression that gave away nothing. He gestured for Sarah to sit. First, I want to thank you for your service, he said. Your military record is impressive. 2 deployments, numerous commendations, exemplary performance under extreme conditions. Sarah's throat tightened. You pulled my military file? We pull files on anyone involved in situations like this. Standard procedure. He leaned back in his chair. Colonel Mitchell is stable but not out of danger. His injuries are extensive and there's concern about potential complications. The doctors here are competent, but they lack experience with this type of trauma. You, however, have that experience. I'm a civilian nurse now. We're not asking you to do anything outside your current scope, Morse interrupted. We're just asking you to watch. Monitor his condition. If you see something the other staff might miss, bring it to their attention. Think of it as an unofficial consultation. And if Dr. Holloway refuses to listen? Morse's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then you contact me directly and I'll handle it. Colonel Mitchell is a high-value asset, Ms. Bennett. His survival is a priority. We don't care about hospital politics. After Morse left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, feeling the walls closing in from every direction. She'd come to Riverside Memorial to escape her past, to build a quiet life where nobody asked questions, and she could just do her job. Instead, her past had found her anyway, and now she was trapped between Holloway's vendetta and the military's expectations. The colonel's room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. He was unconscious, intubated, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Sarah checked his vitals, examined the wound sites, reviewed the flow sheets. Everything looked stable, but she knew from experience how quickly that could change. You really saved his life, didn't you? Sarah turned to find one of the soldiers, the lieutenant colonel from last night, standing in the doorway. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from too many deployments. I did what I was trained to do, Sarah said. At Bagram, right? I was there in 2019. Saw you work on a kid who'd stepped on an IED, 15 years old, shredded from the waist down, and you kept him alive long enough for the surgeons to work miracles. The lieutenant colonel shook his head. I never forgot that. The way you moved, like you were dancing through chaos. Everyone else was panicking, and you were just calm. Sarah remembered that kid. She remembered all of them. Every face, every wound, every desperate fight to keep someone breathing for one more minute. That was the problem with military medicine. You couldn't forget. The memories followed you home and set up permanent residence in your head. What happened to him? She asked quietly. The kid? Lost both legs below the knee, but he lived. Last I heard, he was walking with prosthetics and going to school. The lieutenant colonel extended his hand. David Martinez. I don't think we were ever formally introduced. Sarah shook his hand. You told everyone who I was, last night. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did. The doctor was 2 minutes from killing the colonel with his textbook protocols. You needed credibility fast. Martinez studied her face. You didn't want people to know, though, about your service. No. Can I ask why? Sarah looked at the colonel's unconscious form, at the machines keeping him alive, at the evidence of violence that no civilian should have to witness. Because I'm tired of war, and when people know you've seen combat, they look at you differently, like you're damaged or dangerous or both. Are you? Damaged? The question should have offended her, but Martinez asked it with genuine curiosity, not judgment. Sarah considered lying and decided she was too exhausted. Probably, but I'm functional. That's good enough. Martinez nodded slowly. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're exactly the kind of person Colonel Mitchell needs watching over him right now. These civilian doctors are good, but they don't understand what he's been through. You do. After Martinez left, Sarah finished her assessment and returned to the emergency department. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine cases that felt surreal after the intensity of the previous night. A sprained ankle, a kid with a minor laceration, an elderly woman with a UTI. Normal, everyday problems that normal, everyday nurses could handle without accessing years of trauma training. She was charting notes around 7 when she noticed the whispers. 2 nurses at the station kept glancing at her and muttering to each other. When Sarah made eye contact, they quickly looked away. 10 minutes later, Kelly, the senior nurse who'd assigned her to trauma coverage, stopped by her station. Bennett, can I give you some advice? Kelly didn't wait for an answer. People are talking about what happened last night. Holloway's people are spreading a different version of events, saying you were reckless, that you got lucky, that you endangered the patient by ignoring proper protocols. Sarah's hand stilled on her keyboard. What version are you hearing? That you froze Holloway out of the trauma bay because you wanted to look like a hero. That you performed procedures you weren't authorized for. That the only reason the patient survived was despite your interference, not because of it. Kelly's expression was sympathetic but firm. I don't believe that's what happened, but perception matters. And right now, Holloway's working hard to shape that perception. Why are you telling me this? Kelly hesitated. Because I've worked here for 12 years, and I've seen what happens to people who cross Marcus Holloway. He doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. If I were you, I'd start documenting everything. Every interaction, every case, every conversation. Because he's building a case against you, and you're going to need evidence to defend yourself. After Kelly left, Sarah sat staring at her computer screen, feeling the trap tightening around her. She'd saved a man's life, and somehow that had made her a target. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. Her shift ended at 9. Sarah was gathering her things when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Amy Rodriguez. A bunch of us are getting drinks at Murphy's Bar if you want to join. Would be good to see you outside the hospital. Sarah almost declined automatically. She didn't do social gatherings. She didn't build friendships. She kept her distance because distance was safe. But safe hadn't protected her from Holloway. Safe hadn't stopped her past from catching up. Safe had just made her isolated and vulnerable. She typed back, "Be there in 20. Murphy's Bar was 3 blocks from Riverside Memorial and apparently the default gathering place for hospital staff. Sarah arrived to find Amy at a corner table with 4 other nurses and 2 residents she vaguely recognized. They made room for her, bought her a beer she didn't ask for, and immediately launched into conversation that had nothing to do with medicine. It felt strange, foreign, like speaking a language she'd once known but had mostly forgotten. Can't believe they expect us to work those schedules, one of the residents was saying. 36-hour shifts should be illegal. Try working nights, a nurse countered. Your circadian rhythm just gives up and dies. Amy caught Sarah's eye and smiled. Glad you came. You looked like you needed a drink. That obvious? You've had the same expression all day, like someone waiting for bad news. Amy lowered her voice. Is it true that Holloway's trying to file a complaint against you? So the rumors had already spread that far. Sarah took a long drink from her beer before answering. I don't know what he's doing, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's bullshit, one of the residents said loudly. His name tag read Jason Kim, and he was already on what looked like his 3rd beer. Everyone knows you saved that patient. Holloway's just pissed because you made him look bad. She didn't make him look bad, Amy corrected. He made himself look bad by refusing to listen when someone with more experience tried to help. Yeah, but that's not how Holloway sees it, Jason said. He thinks nurses should know their place, especially nurses who make him look stupid in front of the military brass. The conversation continued around Sarah, but she found herself only half listening. Her mind kept replaying the confrontation in Trauma 1, analyzing every moment, every decision. Had she been too aggressive, too confrontational? Should she have found a different way to handle it? But the colonel's heartbeat had stopped. There hadn't been time for diplomacy. Sarah? Amy was looking at her with concern. You okay? Just tired, Sarah said. Long couple of days. She left Murphy's an hour later feeling both better and worse. Better because she'd connected with people, because they'd supported her, because maybe she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Worse because now she had something to lose. Relationships meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain when things inevitably fell apart. The next morning started with another call from HR. This time, it was a formal meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon, 3 days away. Subject: Performance Review and Professional Conduct. Attendees: Sarah Bennett, Dr. Marcus Holloway, Karen Whitmore, and the hospital's legal counsel. Sarah's stomach dropped. Legal counsel meant this was serious. This was Holloway making his move. She spent the next 3 days walking on eggshells, documenting every interaction, double-checking every procedure, being careful not to give Holloway any ammunition. She checked on Colonel Mitchell twice daily, watched his vitals like a hawk, and reported everything through proper channels. The colonel remained stable but unconscious, his body fighting battles that nobody outside that ICU room could see. On Thursday evening, Sarah was reviewing the colonel's latest labs when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. His white count was rising. Not dramatically, but steadily. And his temperature had ticked up by half a degree. The attending physician had noted the changes but attributed them to normal post-surgical inflammation. Standard practice, textbook response. But Sarah had seen this pattern before. In a field hospital in Kandahar, in a soldier named Martinez, no relation to the lieutenant colonel, who developed a post-blast infection that had nearly killed him before anyone realized what was happening. She immediately requested a full infectious disease workup. The resident on duty, a young woman named Priya, who'd been at Murphy's the other night, looked uncertain. The attending already reviewed these labs. He said it was normal inflammation. I know what he said. I'm asking you to run the tests anyway. But if it's just inflammation, we'll be wasting resources on Priya. Sarah kept her voice level. I've seen blast trauma infections before. They don't present like typical post-surgical infections. They escalate fast, and by the time you catch them through standard monitoring, it's often too late. Please trust me on this. Priya hesitated, clearly torn between following Sarah's judgment and not wanting to overstep. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll order the workup. But if Holloway finds out and the tests come back positive, he'll look like an idiot for missing it. If they come back negative, I'll take the blame. The tests were drawn that night. Sarah went home and didn't sleep, her mind running through worst-case scenarios. If she was wrong, she'd just given Holloway more evidence that she overstepped her authority. If she was right, and they'd caught something early, it would prove her instincts were valuable. And if she was right, but they'd already waited too long, she forced herself not to think about that possibility. Friday morning arrived with rain hammering against Sarah's apartment windows. She dressed carefully for the meeting, clean scrubs, her hair pulled back, no jewelry. Professional. Unremarkable. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything she'd tried to build. At noon, her phone rang. Priya's name flashed on the screen. Sarah, you need to get here now. The colonel's labs came back. You were right. He's developing a deep tissue infection. Sepsis markers are elevated and his pressure is starting to drop. The attending just called for an emergency surgical consult and Priya's voice dropped to a whisper. Holloway's here. He's furious that you ordered the tests without his approval. He's demanding to know who authorized them. Sarah's meeting with HR was in 2 hours. The meeting that would probably end with her termination or worse. But Colonel Mitchell was dying again, and she was the only person in the hospital who'd recognized the signs in time to stop it. The choice should have been impossible. The choice should have required thought, calculation, self-preservation. Instead, Sarah grabbed her keys and ran. She made it to Riverside Memorial in 8 minutes, breaking at least 3 traffic laws. The ICU was chaos. Monitors alarming, staff rushing in and out of the colonel's room, voices raised in controlled panic. And standing in the middle of it all, directing the response like a general commanding troops, was Dr. Marcus Holloway. He saw Sarah the moment she stepped off the elevator. His expression went from focused to furious in a heartbeat. "Bennett," he barked. "My office, now." The colonel is being handled by qualified medical professionals. You, however, are about to be suspended for gross insubordination and practicing outside your scope. Unless you want to make this worse, you'll come with me immediately. Sarah looked past him to where nurses were prepping the colonel for emergency surgery. She could see the surgical team assembling, could see the organized chaos of a system responding to crisis. But she could also see the colonel's pressure dropping on the monitor, could see the blood cultures that hadn't been sent yet, could see the treatment plan that was addressing the symptoms but not the underlying cause. She thought about her meeting in 2 hours, thought about the legal counsel waiting to dissect her every action, thought about Kelly's warning that Holloway was building a case against her. She thought about the kid at Bagram who'd survived because she'd refused to give up. And then she looked Holloway directly in the eye and said, "No." The ICU went silent. Every nurse, every resident, every staff member within earshot froze. Sarah saw shock ripple across Holloway's face, followed by rage so intense she almost stepped back. "What did you just say to me?" "I said no. The colonel's infection isn't responding because you're treating it like a standard post-surgical complication." "It's not. It's a battlefield pathogen, probably picked up during the incident that wounded him. You need to change the antibiotic protocol immediately, send specialized cultures, and prep for possible debridement of the blast sites. And you need to do it now, before he goes into septic shock. Holloway's face had gone purple. You don't give orders in this hospital. You don't diagnose patients, and you certainly don't tell me how to practice medicine. Security! 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the ICU. Sarah felt her heart hammering, but kept her voice steady. You can call security. You can have me arrested if you want, but if you do that before you listen to what I'm telling you, Colonel James Mitchell will be dead by tonight. And you'll have to explain to the Department of Defense why you ignored the warnings of the only person in this hospital with experience treating combat trauma infections. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Sarah watched Holloway's expression shift from rage to calculation. She'd called his bluff in front of everyone, had bet everything on the chance that he cared more about his reputation than his pride. For 5 endless seconds, nobody moved. Then a new voice cut through the tension. She's right. Everyone turned. Agent Morse stood in the ICU doorway, his expression harder than Sarah had ever seen it. Behind him stood Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and 2 more men in suits that screamed federal authority. Morse walked directly to Holloway, stopping close enough that his next words were clearly meant as a threat. Ms. Bennett's assessment is correct. We've been monitoring the situation, and we agree that the colonel's infection profile matches exposure to drug-resistant pathogens common in the theater where he was injured. If you'd like to debate that diagnosis, we can bring in military infectious disease specialists. Or you can listen to the nurse who's already saved his life once and implement her recommendations immediately. Holloway looked like he'd been slapped. This is my hospital. And this is a matter of national security, Morse interrupted. Which means what I say supersedes your authority. Ms. Bennett, you have full authorization to consult on this case. Dr. Holloway, you will implement her recommendations or you will be removed from the case. Am I clear? The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel every eye in the ICU locked on this confrontation. Holloway's face had gone from purple to white, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Crystal, he said finally, the word forced through gritted teeth. What happened next was a blur of controlled chaos. Sarah walked Holloway through the protocol adjustments, citing specific antibiotic combinations that worked against battlefield pathogens. She explained the culture techniques needed to identify the organism. She outlined the surgical approach that would balance infection control with preserving the colonel's healing tissue. Holloway followed her recommendations without a word, his movements mechanical, his expression carved from stone, but he followed them. And within an hour, the colonel's condition started to stabilize. Sarah didn't realize she was shaking until it was over. She stepped out of the ICU into an empty hallway and leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. She'd just burned every bridge she had left. Holloway would never forgive this. The hospital administration would never overlook it. Even if she'd saved the colonel again, she'd destroyed herself in the process. You missed your meeting. Sarah looked up to find Karen Whitmore standing there, holding a folder and looking unreadable. I know, Sarah said. I'm sorry. The colonel was crashing, and Agent Morse already explained the situation. Whitmore's expression didn't change. He also explained that you identified a life-threatening complication that our attending physicians missed. Again. Sarah said nothing. There was nothing to say. Whitmore opened the folder and pulled out several pages. This was going to be your termination paperwork. Dr. Holloway submitted a formal complaint alleging insubordination, practicing outside your scope, and endangering patient safety through reckless decision-making. He had 3 witnesses prepared to testify that you were a liability to this hospital. Sarah's heart sank. Was? The complaint is being withdrawn. Whitmore's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Apparently, the United States military takes a dim view of hospitals that try to fire the people saving their personnel. Agent Morse made it very clear that if we terminated you, Riverside Memorial would face federal scrutiny that would make our lives extremely difficult. Sarah felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. So, I'm not fired? No, you're not fired. Whitmore pulled out another document. However, the situation with Dr. Holloway has become untenable. He's submitted a request for medical leave, effective immediately. Stress-related, according to his physician. He'll be gone for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Sarah tried to process that. 6 weeks without Holloway's hostility, without his constant undermining, without the feeling of walking on knives every time she entered the department. "What happens when he comes back?" she asked. Whitmore's expression went cold. "If he comes back, the hospital board is conducting a review of his conduct, particularly regarding the incidents with Colonel Mitchell. There are questions about whether his judgment was compromised by personal animosity." She closed the folder. "In the meantime, you should know that several staff members have come forward to support you. They've provided statements about Dr. Holloway's pattern of dismissing valid concerns and punishing nurses who question his decisions. Sarah thought of Amy, of Priya, of Kelly, who'd warned her to document everything, people she'd barely known a week ago, stepping forward to defend her. "I don't know what to say," Sarah managed. "Then don't say anything. Just do your job." Whitmore turned to leave, then paused. "Ms. Bennett, what you did today, defying a senior physician in front of staff, making demands about patient care, that took either courage or stupidity. I'm still deciding which." "Maybe both," Sarah said quietly. Whitmore's almost smile returned. "Maybe both." Sarah's shift ended at 7, but she stayed late to check on the colonel one more time. He was stable now, the new antibiotic protocol working, his vitals holding steady. She stood at the foot of his bed, watching the monitors and thinking about how many times she'd stood in rooms like this, watching soldiers fight for their lives. "You're going to make it," she told the unconscious colonel. "You're too stubborn to die in a civilian hospital." "Talking to yourself?" Martinez leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "That's usually a bad sign." "Just making promises I hope I can keep," Sarah said. Martinez walked into the room, studied the monitors with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many medevac situations. "Morse told me what happened. You really told Holloway to shove it in front of everyone?" "Not in those exact words, but essentially yes." "And you knew it would probably cost you your job?" Sarah thought about that. "I knew it might, but the colonel was dying, and I was the only one who recognized it. What was I supposed to do? Most people would have protected themselves. Let someone else take the risk." "I'm not most people." Martinez laughed, a short, sharp sound. "No, you're really not." He sobered. "The colonel's going to want to thank you when he wakes up. Both times you've saved him now." "I was just doing my job." "No, you did way more than your job. You put your entire career on the line for a man you don't even know." Martinez met her eyes. "That's not duty. That's honor. And it's rare as hell." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the ICU's family waiting area, exhausted beyond measure. Her phone had 17 missed calls, most from numbers she didn't recognize, probably reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the military patient and the nurse causing drama. She turned it off. The hospital around her hummed with normal nighttime activity, alarms beeping, footsteps in hallways, the whisper of voices discussing cases and shift changes. The same sound she'd heard in a dozen different hospitals, in clinics and field hospitals and aid stations across 2 countries. She'd thought she was done with that life, thought she could leave it behind and become someone normal, someone unremarkable, someone safe. But safety had never been the point, had it? The point had been to help people, to save lives, to stand between death and the people fighting to survive. And if that meant making enemies of people like Holloway, if that meant risking her career, if that meant dragging her buried past into the light, well, maybe that was the price of being who she actually was instead of who she'd been pretending to be. Sarah was gathering her things to finally go home when Agent Morse appeared one more time, his expression grave. "Miss Bennett, we need to talk, somewhere private." They found another empty conference room. Morse closed the door and pulled out his phone, bringing up what looked like a secure messaging app. "I've received updated intel on Colonel Mitchell's case," he said. "The attack that wounded him wasn't random. He was targeted because of classified work he's been doing on military medical protocols, specifically combat trauma response systems." Sarah's exhaustion evaporated, replaced by sharp focus. "Someone targeted him for his medical work? We can't give you details, but yes. And here's where it gets complicated. We have reason to believe the people responsible may attempt to finish what they started." Morse looked directly at her. "The colonel is still in danger. We're increasing security, but we also need medical personnel we can trust absolutely, people who can't be compromised or intimidated." You want me to watch him? We want you to keep him alive until we can move him to a secure military facility. That'll be at least another week, maybe 2, depending on his recovery. Morse's expression was deadly serious. This goes beyond medical care, Ms. Bennett. We're asking you to be part of his protection detail. Can you do that? Sarah thought about saying no. Thought about all the reasons she should refuse. The danger, the complexity, the way this was pulling her deeper into a world she'd tried to escape. Instead, she heard herself say, "Yes." Morse nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll have personnel briefing you tomorrow on security protocols. In the meantime," he paused, his phone buzzing. He glanced at it, and his expression went dark. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Morse looked up, and Sarah saw real concern in his eyes for the first time. "Someone just accessed Colonel Mitchell's medical records from an external location. Someone who shouldn't have those credentials." The room seemed to tilt. "How is that possible?" "We're investigating, but Ms. Bennett," Morse's voice went hard. "Until we figure out who breached our security, you need to assume that everyone in this hospital is potentially compromised. Trust no one. Report anything suspicious directly to me. And whatever you do, don't let anyone you don't know get close to the colonel." He left her with those instructions and a direct phone number that went straight to his personal line. Sarah sat alone in the conference room, her mind racing. The colonel was still in danger. Someone had accessed his records, and she'd just agreed to stand between him and whoever wanted him dead. Sarah walked to the ICU's observation window and looked at the colonel's room. The monitors blinked steadily. The nurses moved through their routines. Everything looked normal. But somewhere in this hospital, or outside it, someone was watching, waiting, planning. And the quiet nurse who just wanted to disappear had just become the only thing standing between a target and the people hunting him. The breach happened at 2:13 in the morning. Sarah had been dozing in a chair outside the colonel's ICU room when her phone vibrated with a text from Morse. "Security camera on 3rd floor corridor. Just went dark. Stay alert." She was on her feet immediately, her exhaustion evaporating as training kicked in. The ICU floor was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of monitors and ventilators seemed muffled, distant. One of the soldiers posted outside the colonel's door noticed her tension and straightened, his hand moving subtly toward his sidearm. Sarah approached the nurse's station where a single night nurse sat charting. "Has anyone been up here in the last 15 minutes? Maintenance? Anyone you didn't recognize?" The nurse, an older woman named Patricia, looked up with confusion. "No, it's been dead quiet. Why?" Before Sarah could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then the entire corridor plunged into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after 3 seconds that felt like an eternity, bathing everything in dim red. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard Patricia gasp behind her. "Power failure?" the soldier asked, but his weapon was already drawn. "Or someone cut the main lines," Sarah said. She pulled out her phone and dialed Morse. It went straight to voicemail. The second soldier moved to check the stairwell door. He'd barely touched the handle when it exploded inward, and a figure in dark clothing burst through with something raised in his hand. Sarah didn't think. She grabbed the nearest object, a metal chart holder, and hurled it at the intruder's head. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man stumbled. The soldier was on him in a heartbeat, slamming him face first into the floor while his partner called for backup. "Lock down," the first soldier shouted. "Now!" Patricia hit the emergency button, and steel doors began sliding across the ICU entrance. Sarah ran to the colonel's room, her mind racing through scenarios. If this was a coordinated attack, there would be more than one person. Multiple entry points. Distractions. She reached the colonel's bedside just as his monitor started alarming. His IV line was running too fast. Someone had adjusted the drip rate. Sarah's blood went cold as she recognized the medication bag. Potassium chloride. In the right dose, it maintained electrolyte balance. In the wrong dose, it stopped hearts. "Get me Morse," she yelled to the soldiers, "and shut down this IV now." Her hands moved on autopilot, clamping the line, checking the dosage, calculating how much had already gone in. The colonel's heart rhythm was shifting on the monitor. Early signs of hyperkalemia. Too much potassium in the blood. Sarah started barking orders to Patricia, who'd recovered from her shock and was moving to help. "I need calcium gluconate, insulin, and D50. Move!" The next 5 minutes blurred together. Sarah worked to counteract the potassium overdose while armed personnel flooded the ICU. The intruder in the hallway was subdued and zip-tied, his face bleeding from where the chart holder had hit him. More security swept every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. And through it all, Sarah kept her hand steady and her voice calm, walking the colonel back from the edge of cardiac arrest for the third time in as many days. When Morse finally arrived at 2:47, the colonel was stable, but Sarah was shaking with delayed adrenaline. "Someone changed his IV," she told Morse without preamble. "Increased the potassium drip to lethal levels. If the intruder hadn't triggered the alarm, we wouldn't have noticed until it was too late." Morse's expression was carved from granite. "The man we caught isn't talking. No ID, no wallet, nothing. Professional." He looked at the colonel, then back at Sarah. "You saved him again." "I got lucky. If they'd been smarter about the distraction, they were smart enough to breach a secure facility and nearly succeed." Morse pulled Sarah aside, lowering his voice. "We're moving him, tonight. We can't wait for him to stabilize further. Every hour he stays here is another opportunity for them to try again." "He's not ready for transport," Sarah protested. "His infection is still being treated. His wounds—" "I'm not asking your permission, Ms. Bennett. I'm telling you what's happening." Morse's tone left no room for argument. "We have a military medical transport on standby. He'll be moved to a secure facility with full ICU capabilities. But we need someone who knows his case, who understands his injuries, someone we can trust." Sarah understood what he was asking before he said it. "You want me to go with him? The transport team will have combat medics, but none of them have your specific experience with his injury pattern. You've kept him alive through 3 critical incidents. We need that continuity of care." Morse paused. "And frankly, after tonight, I'm not sure we can trust everyone in this hospital." The implications hit Sarah like cold water. Someone on the inside had helped. Had to have. The IV bag had been swapped on a secured floor during a shift change when only authorized personnel had access. That meant a doctor, a nurse, or a pharmacy tech had been compromised. "How long would I be gone?" Sarah asked. 72 hours minimum, maybe a week depending on his condition. You'd be compensated and the hospital has already agreed to the arrangement. Sarah thought about her apartment, her routine, the fragile stability she'd built in Crescent Falls. Thought about walking away from it, even temporarily, to follow a dying colonel into a world of armed transports and classified facilities. She thought about the kid at Bagram, the soldier named Martinez who'd survived a blast infection, the 17 lives she'd saved in places where saving lives meant becoming a target yourself. "When do we leave?" she said. The military moved with efficiency that made hospital logistics look glacial. By 4:30, the colonel was prepped for transport. By 5, a second Black Hawk had landed on the roof. By 5:15, Sarah was strapped into a jump seat with her go bag at her feet, watching Riverside Memorial disappear beneath them as the helicopter climbed into the pre-dawn darkness. Martinez sat across from her, along with 2 combat medics and enough security personnel to invade a small country. The colonel was strapped to a specialized transport gurney, monitors showing vitals that were stable but fragile. "First time back in one of these since you got out?" Martinez asked over the rotor noise. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The smell was the same, fuel and metal and the underlying scent of fear that every military transport carried. Her body remembered this, even if her mind had tried to forget. They flew for 90 minutes before landing at what Martinez identified as a joint military medical facility in an undisclosed location. Sarah was too disoriented to track their route, but the base they arrived at was massive, sprawling buildings, security checkpoints, personnel moving with purpose through the early morning light. The colonel was transferred immediately to a state-of-the-art ICU that made Riverside Memorial's equipment look outdated. Sarah spent the next 6 hours going over every detail of his care with military physicians who actually listened to her, who valued her input, who treated her expertise with respect instead of dismissal. It felt surreal and wrong, because this level of competence and collaboration should have been normal, should have been what every hospital provided. Instead, it had taken a near-assassination attempt and federal intervention to get her here. By noon, Sarah was running on fumes. A captain showed her to temporary quarters, a small room with a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the base. She meant to just sit down for a minute. Instead, she collapsed into sleep so deep that when someone knocked on her door 3 hours later, she woke up disoriented and panicked. "Miss Bennett?" A woman's voice, professional and crisp. "I'm Dr. Rachel Keating, infectious disease. I need to consult with you about the Colonel's antibiotic regimen." Sarah forced herself awake and opened the door to find a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an iPad covered in lab results. They spent 40 minutes discussing the Colonel's infection, the battlefield pathogen that had been identified, and the treatment protocol Sarah had initiated at Riverside. "You caught this fast," Keating said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Another 12 hours and we'd have been dealing with full septic shock. How did you recognize the presentation?" Sarah explained about the patterns she'd seen overseas, the subtle differences between standard post-surgical infections and combat-acquired pathogens. Keating listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, treating Sarah like a colleague instead of a subordinate. "I'd like your permission to cite this case in a paper I'm writing on battlefield infection protocols," Keating said as they finished. "Your diagnostic instinct saved this man's life. That kind of clinical judgment should be documented." The idea of being cited in a medical paper, of her nursing knowledge being valued at that level, left Sarah speechless. At Riverside, Holloway had treated her observations like annoyances. Here, they were being recognized as legitimate contributions to military medicine. "I'd be honored," Sarah managed. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah fell into a rhythm she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. She worked alongside physicians who respected her input, medics who valued her experience, and command personnel who understood that rank and expertise weren't always the same thing. The Colonel's condition slowly improved, infection markers dropping, vitals stabilizing, the first signs of consciousness returning. On the third day, Martinez found Sarah in the cafeteria picking at food she was too tired to taste. "Morse wants to see you," he said. "Conference room B. And Bennett?" His expression was serious. "They caught the person who helped with the attack at Riverside." Sarah's exhaustion vanished. She followed Martinez to a secure briefing room where Morse sat with 2 other agents and a laptop displaying surveillance footage. "Miss Bennett, thank you for coming," Morse gestured to a chair. "We've identified the insider who facilitated the assassination attempt. I thought you should know before we proceed with arrests." He turned the laptop screen toward her. Sarah found herself looking at security footage from Riverside Memorial's pharmacy, timestamped the night before the attack. A figure in scrubs moved through the medication storage area, switching IV bags with practiced efficiency. The person's face came into clear view as they turned toward the camera. Sarah's breath caught. It was Patricia, the night nurse who'd been at the station when the attack happened, the older woman who'd seemed confused and frightened, who'd helped Sarah save the Colonel after the IV tampering was discovered. "She didn't know the backup plan," Morse said quietly. "Her job was to swap the IV bag and leave. When the direct assault failed, the potassium was supposed to finish the job quietly. But you caught it too fast." He paused. "She's been working at Riverside for 18 years, widowed 5 years ago, 2 kids in college, and drowning in debt from her husband's medical bills." Sarah felt sick. They paid her to kill him. $50,000. Enough to clear her debt and give her kids a fresh start. Morse's expression was hard. "She's in federal custody now. We wanted to know if you had any insight into her behavior, anything that might have seemed suspicious." Sarah forced herself to think back through that night, through the chaos and fear. Patricia had seemed genuinely shocked by the attack, had helped save the Colonel without hesitation, had shown no signs of guilt or deception. "She was good," Sarah said finally. "Too good. I never suspected." "Neither did we until we pulled the pharmacy footage." Morse closed the laptop. "The attack was orchestrated by a group with connections to the Colonel's classified work. We're still tracking the full network, but Patricia was their access point. She gave them the security schedules, the staffing rotations, the Colonel's medical status." "And Holloway?" Sarah asked. "Was he involved?" "No. Ironically, Dr. Holloway is exactly what he appears to be. An arrogant physician with an ego problem. Not a security threat, just an obstacle." Morse leaned back in his chair. "Which brings me to why I wanted to talk to you. When this is over, when the Colonel is out of danger and the investigation wraps up, you'll return to Riverside Memorial. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah hadn't let herself think that far ahead. "I don't know if I can go back. Not after everything that's happened. You can't run from this, Ms. Bennett. What you did, standing up to Holloway, saving the colonel, exposing corruption, that matters. Riverside Memorial needs nurses like you. The whole system needs people who won't back down when someone tries to silence them. Holloway will come back eventually, Sarah said. And when he does, he'll find a very different situation than the one he left. Morse pulled out another folder. The hospital board received a full report on the incidents surrounding Colonel Mitchell's care. Your actions. Holloway's negligence, the pattern of intimidation and suppression of valid medical concerns. They're conducting a formal review that will likely result in significant disciplinary action, possibly termination. Sarah stared at him. You're telling me Holloway might lose his job? I'm telling you that people are finally paying attention. That nurse you worked with, Amy Rodriguez, she organized a petition signed by 43 staff members detailing complaints about Holloway's conduct. The residents you saved that patient with submitted formal statements. Even some of the attending physicians who stayed quiet before are coming forward now. Morse met her eyes. You started something, Ms. Bennett. You showed people they didn't have to accept being silenced. Now they're finding their own voices. On the morning of the fourth day, Colonel James Mitchell opened his eyes. Sarah was checking his vitals when she saw his eyelids flutter. She immediately called for the medical team, but she stayed at his bedside, watching as consciousness slowly returned. Welcome back, Colonel, she said quietly. Mitchell's eyes focused on her with difficulty. His mouth moved, but the ventilator tube prevented speech. Sarah could see questions in his expression. Where am I? What happened? How long? You're safe, she told him. Secure military facility. You've been through hell, but you're going to make it. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Martinez appeared at the doorway, and the colonel's gaze shifted to him. Some silent communication passed between the two men, the kind of wordless understanding that came from shared service. The medical team arrived and began the process of weaning Mitchell off the ventilator. It took another 6 hours, but by evening, he was breathing on his own and able to speak in a hoarse whisper. You, he rasped when he saw Sarah. You're the nurse. From the hospital. Sarah Bennett, she confirmed. They told me you saved my life. Multiple times. Mitchell's voice was weak but clear. Is that true? Sarah felt uncomfortable with the direct question. I did my job. No. Mitchell's hand moved slightly on the bed, a gesture toward her. Martinez told me everything. You stood up to that doctor, risked your career, stopped an assassination attempt. He paused to gather strength. That's not just doing your job. That's putting yourself between me and death. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about all the easy answers she could give. Duty, training, professionalism. But Mitchell's eyes demanded honesty, and somehow she felt like he deserved it. Because I've seen what happens when good people stay quiet, she said finally. When they follow orders they know are wrong, when they don't speak up because it's safer to stay invisible. People die. And I'm tired of being quiet. Mitchell held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he raised his hand in a weak approximation of a salute. Thank you, Sergeant Bennett. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. Nobody had called her that in 3 years. Nobody in civilian life knew that rank or what it meant to her. But Mitchell knew, understood, recognized not just what she'd done but who she'd been. She returned the salute, her hand steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The next morning, Morse informed Sarah that she'd be returning to Crescent Falls that afternoon. The colonel was stable enough that the military medical team could handle his ongoing care. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Her part in this was over. Almost. There's going to be a commendation ceremony, Morse said as they walked toward the landing pad where the helicopter waited. The colonel insisted. He wants to publicly acknowledge what you did. It'll be classified, limited attendance, but your actions will be on record. I don't need recognition, Sarah said. Maybe not, but other people need to see it happen. Need to understand that standing up for what's right doesn't always end in punishment. Morse stopped before they reached the helicopter. What you did at Riverside Memorial, that's going to echo beyond this case, Ms. Bennett. You showed people that one person can make a difference, that nurses have power beyond what the hierarchy wants to acknowledge. Don't underestimate the impact of that. The flight back to Crescent Falls took 2 hours. Sarah spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change below, feeling the weight of the past 4 days settling into her bones. She'd saved a man's life, exposed corruption, challenged authority, and somehow survived all of it. But Morse's words kept echoing in her mind. When this is over, you'll return to Riverside Memorial. The thought filled her with equal parts dread and determination. The helicopter landed at a private airfield outside the city. A car drove Sarah back to her apartment where everything was exactly as she'd left it. Coffee cup in the sink, unmade bed, the profound ordinariness of a life interrupted. She had 36 hours before her next scheduled shift at Riverside Memorial. Sarah spent the first 12 hours sleeping. The next 24 she spent preparing, reviewing her documentation, organizing her notes, mentally rehearsing conversations she might need to have. She also called Amy, who answered on the first ring and immediately launched into an excited monologue about everything that had happened while Sarah was gone. And then the board showed up unannounced and started interviewing everyone. And people are finally talking about all the stuff Holloway's done. And there's this rumor that he might not come back at all. And Amy took a breath. Sarah, you started a revolution. I just did my job, Sarah said, but the words felt hollow even to her. Yeah, well, your job apparently includes toppling corrupt doctors and saving military colonels. You're kind of famous now, in a classified, can't-talk-about-it way. When Sarah walked into Riverside Memorial for her next shift, she braced for hostility, for whispers, for the cold shoulder she'd experienced so many times before. Instead, she found something else entirely. Nurses nodded respectfully as she passed. Residents who'd previously ignored her stopped to say hello. The charge nurse assigned her to primary trauma coverage, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement of her skills. And in the break room, someone had posted Amy's petition on the bulletin board. 43 signatures. 43 people who'd decided that silence wasn't worth the cost anymore. Sarah was reviewing patient charts when Karen Whitmore appeared in the emergency department, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Ms. Bennett, could I speak with you privately? They found an empty consultation room. Whitmore closed the door and pulled out a folder that Sarah recognized, her personnel file. The hospital board concluded their investigation this morning, Whitmore said. Dr. Holloway has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full disciplinary review. Multiple complaints have been substantiated, including suppression of valid medical concerns, intimidation of staff, and negligent patient care decisions. She paused. There's also discussion of revoking his position as chief of emergency medicine. Sarah felt the words wash over her but couldn't quite process them. Holloway, arrogant, untouchable Holloway, facing real consequences for his actions. Additionally, Whitmore continued, the board wanted me to extend a formal apology to you. Your competence was questioned, your judgment was undermined, and you were subjected to a hostile work environment. That was unacceptable, and it won't happen again. What does that mean practically? Sarah asked. Whitmore's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. It means you have the board's full support. It means your military experience will be recognized as a valuable asset rather than dismissed. And it means... She pulled out another document. You're being offered a position as trauma nursing coordinator with authority to develop protocols for complex trauma cases. Significant pay increase, direct input on department policies, and a seat at the table when critical decisions are made. Sarah stared at the job offer, at the title that would put her on equal administrative footing with senior physicians, at the salary that was nearly double what she currently made. I don't understand, she said. A week ago, I was almost fired. Now you're promoting me? A week ago, we were blind to systemic problems in our emergency department. You forced us to look. Forced us to acknowledge that expertise comes in many forms and that silencing voices because they challenge authority is not just wrong, it's dangerous. Whitmore met Sarah's eyes. You saved a man's life 3 times, Ms. Bennett. You exposed corruption. You showed moral courage that most people only talk about. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she took the document. After everything, after years of being invisible, being dismissed, being told to stay in her lane, someone was finally offering her a seat at the table. I need to think about it, she heard herself say. Whitmore nodded. Take the time you need. But Ms. Bennett, Don't let fear make this decision for you. You've already proven you're capable of much more than you've been allowed to do. After Whitmore left, Sarah sat alone with the job offer in her hands and a choice that felt too big to process. She could accept this position, could step into leadership, could use her experience to change how Riverside Memorial treated trauma patients and the nurses who cared for them. Or she could walk away. Find another city, another hospital, another chance to disappear. Her phone buzzed. A text from Martinez. "Colonel's awake and asking about you. Wants to know when you're coming back for that ceremony. Says he's not accepting any medal unless you're there to receive one too." Sarah read the message 3 times. Then she pulled up Amy's last text. "Whatever you decide, we've got your back. You're not alone anymore." She thought about the kid from Bagram walking on prosthetics, about the soldier named Martinez surviving a blast infection, about Colonel James Mitchell breathing because she'd refused to stay quiet when it mattered, about 43 people who'd found the courage to sign their names to a petition because one person had shown them it was possible. Sarah was drafting a response when the emergency department PA system crackled to life. "Trauma alert incoming, mass casualty incident, ETA 3 minutes. She stood, putting her phone away, muscle memory already moving her toward the trauma bay. The job offer could wait. The decision could wait. Right now, people needed help, and that was something she knew how to do. But as she grabbed supplies and prepared for whatever was coming through those doors, Sarah Bennett felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not resignation, purpose. She was still preparing when the first ambulance screamed into the bay, and she heard the paramedic's voice shouting words that made her blood turn to ice. "Multiple gunshot wounds, officer down, pressure dropping fast. He's asking for the military nurse, says she's the only one who can save him." And when they rushed the gurney past her, Sarah saw the patient's face, and everything stopped. It was Marcus Holloway, covered in blood and barely conscious, his eyes finding hers with desperate recognition. For 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, Sarah stood frozen. Her brain couldn't reconcile the image. Marcus Holloway, the man who'd tried to destroy her career, now bleeding out on a gurney and asking for her by name. "Bennett." The resident pushing the gurney looked panicked. "He keeps saying you're the only one who can help him. Something about combat trauma. Sarah's training overrode everything else. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, her hands already reaching for gloves as the team rushed Holloway into Trauma 1. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. "Shooting at his house. 3 GSWs. Chest, abdomen, left thigh. He was conscious enough to tell the paramedics he needed you specifically, kept repeating your name." They transferred Holloway to the trauma bed, and Sarah got her first clear look at the damage. The chest wound was high, possibly grazing the subclavian artery. The abdominal wound was actively bleeding. The thigh shot had torn through muscle but missed the femoral artery by centimeters. Holloway's eyes found hers through the oxygen mask. His lips moved, forming words she could barely hear over the monitor alarms. "Please," he whispered, "don't let me die." Sarah felt something twist in her chest. This was the man who'd humiliated her, who'd tried to have her fired, who'd built a career on silencing people like her. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to let someone else handle this, to watch karma deliver its verdict. But she'd taken an oath, and that oath didn't come with exceptions for people who'd wronged her. "Get me 2 units O-neg and call surgery," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to stabilize him for transport to the OR. Someone start another IV line. His pressure's tanking." She worked alongside the trauma team with mechanical precision, compressing wounds, managing fluids, keeping Holloway conscious enough to maintain his airway. His eyes tracked her movements with desperate intensity, as if she was the only anchor keeping him tethered to life. "Sarah," he managed between gasping breaths, "I'm sorry. For everything. I was wrong." "Save your strength," she interrupted, not ready to process whatever confession he was trying to make. "You need surgery. Just stay with me." The OR team arrived within minutes and whisked Holloway away. Sarah stepped back from the trauma bay, her gloves covered in his blood, and felt the delayed shock hit her like a freight train. Amy appeared at her side, eyes wide. "What the hell just happened? Why was Holloway asking for you?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. But the question echoed in her mind as she cleaned up and filed her documentation. Why would Holloway, who despised her, who'd spent weeks trying to discredit her, specifically request her help when he was dying? The answer came 2 hours later when Agent Morse appeared in the emergency department with 3 other federal agents. "Ms. Bennett, we need to talk. Now." They commandeered the same consultation room where Whitmore had offered Sarah the promotion. Morse's expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "Marcus Holloway was shot at his residence at approximately 1500 hours today," Morse said without preamble. "The shooter escaped, but we recovered shell casings and preliminary evidence suggests professional execution. This wasn't random violence." Sarah's stomach dropped. "You think it's connected to the colonel?" "We think Holloway stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to know." Morse pulled up security footage on his tablet. "This is from Riverside Memorial's administrative offices, recorded 4 days ago while you were at the secure facility." The video showed Holloway entering the records department after hours. He moved furtively, checking over his shoulder, accessing files that Sarah recognized as patient records. The colonel's records. "He was investigating," Morse continued. "We found notes in his house. Questions about the colonel's case, about the assassination attempt, about Patricia's involvement. He'd figured out there was an inside operation, and he was trying to expose it." Sarah felt the room tilt. "Holloway was trying to help?" "Or trying to cover his own ass," one of the other agents said. "We found communication records between Holloway and an unknown number. He'd been in contact with someone connected to the network that targeted the colonel. We're still determining if he was part of the conspiracy or if he was blackmailed into cooperation." "That doesn't make sense," Sarah said. "Why would he ask for me if he was working with the people who tried to kill the colonel?" Morse's expression softened slightly. "Because he knew you were the only person in this hospital who'd proven you couldn't be bought or intimidated. Whatever he discovered, whatever mess he was in, he trusted you to keep him alive long enough to reveal it." The irony was almost too much to process. The man who'd spent weeks destroying her reputation now trusted her more than anyone else in the building. "Is he going to survive?" Morse asked. "I don't know. The chest wound is serious. If he makes it through surgery..." Sarah paused. "When can I talk to him?" "If he wakes up, we need to debrief him first. But Ms. Bennett, you should know, the people who shot Holloway are still out there. They failed to kill the colonel, failed to keep their conspiracy hidden, and now they're cleaning up loose ends. That makes you a potential target too." Sarah thought about Patricia, about the assassination attempt, about how easily violence had infiltrated the hospital she'd thought was safe. "You think they'll come after me?" "I think anyone connected to the colonel's case is at risk until we shut this down completely." Morse stood. "We're increasing security around the hospital. Stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone, and if you see anything suspicious, you call me immediately." After the agents left, Sarah sat alone in the consultation room, trying to organize the pieces of a puzzle that kept getting more complicated. Holloway shot. Patricia arrested. The colonel still in danger. And somewhere in the shadows, people who were willing to kill to protect whatever secret they were hiding. Her phone buzzed. "Amy again. Holloway's out of surgery, stable but critical. They're putting him in the ICU." Sarah made her way to the ICU and found Holloway's room under guard. Not military this time, but Crescent Falls PD and federal agents. She badged in and approached his bed. Holloway looked diminished without his arrogance. Pale, intubated, monitors tracking every fragile heartbeat. Sarah checked his chart and saw that the surgical team had done good work. He'd lost a lot of blood, but if infection didn't set in and no complications arose, he might actually survive. "Ms. Bennett?" Sarah turned to find Dr. Keating, the infectious disease specialist from the military facility, standing in the doorway. "Dr. Keating? What are you doing here?" The federal agents requested a consult. They're concerned about potential contamination from the ammunition used in the shooting. Keating held up her tablet, showing lab results. The bullets that hit Dr. Holloway were analyzed. They're clean, but the shooter's choice of weapon suggests military-grade equipment. We're being cautious. They reviewed Holloway's labs together, and Sarah found herself grateful for Keating's expertise. As they worked, Keating said quietly, "I heard what happened before the shooting, about the job offer, about everything you've been through here." Sarah didn't know how to respond. "For what it's worth," Keating continued, "you handled an impossible situation with more grace than most people could manage. Saving someone who tried to destroy you, that takes real character. I'm just doing my job, Sarah said, the words automatic. No, you're doing what's right even when it costs you something. There's a difference. That night, Sarah stayed late monitoring Holloway's condition. Around 11, his sedation was reduced enough that his eyes fluttered open. He couldn't speak around the ventilator tube, but his gaze found her immediately. Sarah pulled a chair close to his bed. You're stable. Surgery went well. You're going to recover. Holloway's hand moved weakly on the bed. Sarah understood. He was trying to write. She grabbed a pad and pen and placed it in his hand. His writing was shaky but legible. They threatened my daughter. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew Holloway had a daughter in medical school. He'd mentioned her occasionally during his more grandiose speeches about medical dynasties. Holloway wrote more. Said they'd kill her if I didn't help cover up the colonel's case. I refused, tried to expose them instead. So that was it. Holloway hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been coerced into silence and had tried to fight back. The shooting was punishment for his defiance. Where's your daughter now? Sarah asked. Holloway wrote, Safe house. Feds moved her yesterday. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the man lying broken in front of her. Holloway was arrogant, dismissive, and had created a toxic work environment through his ego and insecurity. But when his daughter's life was threatened, he'd chosen to protect her even knowing it might cost him everything. Maybe people were more complicated than she'd wanted to believe. She called Morse and relayed what Holloway had communicated. Within an hour, federal agents were in the ICU taking down every detail Holloway could provide through his labored writing. The network was bigger than anyone had realized. Not just an attempt to kill one colonel, but a systematic effort to suppress military medical research that threatened certain pharmaceutical contracts. The colonel's work on battlefield trauma protocols could revolutionize emergency medicine and destroy billions in profits for companies selling expensive but outdated treatments. Patricia had been just one small piece. There were others: a hospital administrator who'd buried incident reports, a pharmacy contractor who'd provided the lethal IV bags, and according to Holloway's notes, at least 2 physicians at Riverside who were on the payroll. We need names, Morse told Holloway, who was now sitting partially upright, the ventilator tube removed but oxygen cannula in place. Holloway's voice was hoarse and weak. Dr. Philip Renner, surgery department, and someone in administration. I never got confirmation, but the pattern pointed to Gerald Voss, the CFO. Sarah remembered Renner. He'd been one of the senior physicians who'd always seemed too interested in the colonel's case, and Voss had unusual access to security protocols and staffing schedules. Morse made calls. Agents moved. Within 3 hours, both Renner and Voss were in federal custody, their homes and offices being searched, their communications being analyzed. The conspiracy was unraveling fast. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah watched the fallout spread through Riverside Memorial, like a controlled demolition. Federal agents conducted interviews. Staff members who'd stayed silent about suspicious activity suddenly found their voices. The local news caught wind of the story, not the classified details about the colonel, but enough to report that federal authorities were investigating corruption and a potential criminal conspiracy at the hospital. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting. Karen Whitmore looked 10 years older when she emerged to make a public statement about cooperation with federal authorities and commitment to transparency. And Sarah found herself at the center of conversations she'd never expected to have. Interviews with investigators, consultations with federal prosecutors building their case, questions from journalists who'd somehow learned she was connected to the breaking scandal. Through it all, she kept working, kept showing up for shifts, kept treating patients with the same focus she'd always had. But everything felt different now. Nurses who'd ignored her before asked her opinion on cases. Residents sought her guidance. Even the attending physicians, the ones who weren't under investigation, treated her with a respect that bordered on deference. On the 4th day after Holloway's shooting, Sarah was called to another meeting with Whitmore. This time, 3 board members were present, along with the hospital's legal team. Ms. Bennett, the board chair said, a distinguished woman in her 60s named Dr. Sandra Michaels. We owe you an apology that goes beyond words. The investigation has revealed systemic failures in our hospital's oversight and culture. You tried to raise concerns about patient safety and were punished for it. That's unconscionable. Sarah waited for the other shoe to drop. Apologies from institutions usually came with conditions. We'd like to formally offer you the position of Director of Trauma Services, Dr. Michaels continued. Not just trauma nursing coordinator, full director. You'd oversee all aspects of trauma care, have authority over protocols and staffing, and report directly to this board. We need someone who's proven they'll prioritize patients over politics. The room went quiet. Sarah looked at the faces around the table, board members who'd allowed Holloway's reign of intimidation, administrators who'd looked the other way when nurses complained, legal counsel who'd protected the institution instead of its staff. Why should I trust you? Sarah asked. A week ago, this hospital almost fired me. Now you want to put me in charge? Dr. Michaels didn't flinch. Because we failed. Because we created an environment where someone like Dr. Holloway could abuse his authority for years without consequence. Because we ignored warning signs that patients were being endangered. And because you proved that one person with courage can expose what we were all too comfortable to see. She paused. We can't fix the past, but we can build something better. We need you to help us do that. Sarah thought about walking away. About finding another hospital in another city where nobody knew her name or her history. About the peace of anonymity. Then she thought about Amy and the 43 signatures. About the young residents who'd started asking questions instead of blindly following authority. About the changes already rippling through Riverside Memorial because someone had finally said no to business as usual. I want guarantees, Sarah said, in writing. Protection for staff who raise safety concerns. Independent oversight of complaints against senior physicians. Regular audits of patient outcomes. And I want the authority to fire anyone, including doctors, who puts ego over patient care. Dr. Michaels smiled. Done. Our legal team will draft the agreement. One more thing, Sarah added. Dr. Holloway, when he recovers, I want him offered a position as a clinical educator. Not patient care, teaching. He knows medicine, but he needs to learn how to respect the people who work alongside him. The board members exchanged glances. Whitmore looked surprised but thoughtful. You want to help the man who tried to destroy you? Dr. Michaels asked. I want to give him a chance to be better than he was, Sarah said. People deserve second chances, even people who don't think they need them. That evening, Sarah visited Holloway in the ICU. He was awake and breathing on his own now, though still weak. When she entered, his expression shifted through several emotions. Shame, gratitude, something that might have been hope. I heard about the directorship, he said, his voice still rough. Congratulations. Sarah pulled up a chair. I recommended you for a teaching position. Holloway stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Why would you do that? After everything Because you're a good doctor who became a terrible leader, Sarah interrupted, and because your daughter deserves to see her father learn from his mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. Holloway's eyes went glossy. I don't deserve your mercy. Probably not. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because the system that created you needs to change. You can be part of that change, or you can be a cautionary tale. Your choice. Before Holloway could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. Colonel's being discharged from secure facility tomorrow, wants to return to Riverside for final evaluation before going home. Says he won't trust anyone but you. Sarah showed the text to Holloway, who read it and then closed his eyes. He should have died, Holloway said quietly. That first night, when you challenged me, I knew you were right. I knew his injuries needed a different approach. But I was so angry that you'd question me in front of everyone that I'd rather have been right and wrong than admit a nurse knew more than I did. He opened his eyes. I almost killed him because of my pride. But you didn't, Sarah said. I stopped you. That's why systems need checks and balances. Why voices at every level matter. I'm sorry, Holloway said, and this time the words carried weight. For all of it. The humiliation, the incident reports, the way I tried to make you invisible. You're a better medical professional than I'll ever be. Sarah stood to leave. Then prove it. Come back different. Teach residents that expertise comes in many forms. Help build a culture where people like me don't have to fight just to be heard. She was at the door when Holloway spoke again. Sarah, thank you. For saving my life, for giving me another chance, for being everything I should have been. The next afternoon, Colonel James Mitchell returned to Riverside Memorial for his final evaluation before being released to outpatient care. He walked into the hospital lobby without assistance, moving slowly but steadily, looking 1,000 times better than the dying man Sarah had first seen. A small ceremony had been arranged in one of the conference rooms. Limited attendance as Morse had promised, but enough witnesses to make it official. Hospital board members, key staff, military representatives, and federal agents filled the space. Mitchell stood at a podium that had been set up for the occasion. His voice was strong despite his recent ordeal. "I'm here today because of exceptional courage under impossible circumstances," he began. "Nurse Sarah Bennett didn't just save my life once. She saved it 3 times through medical expertise, moral courage, and a refusal to back down when people in authority told her she was wrong." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "But more than that, she exposed a conspiracy that threatened not just my life, but the integrity of military medical research and the safety of this hospital's patients." Mitchell gestured and Martinez approached carrying a small case. Inside was a medal, the Soldier's Medal for Heroism, civilian version. "This is normally reserved for military personnel," Mitchell continued, "but I pulled strings, a lot of strings, because what Ms. Bennett did went beyond medical care. She stood between me and people who wanted me dead. She risked her career, her safety, and her life to do what was right." He pinned the medal to Sarah's collar while cameras flashed and people applauded. Then he stepped back and saluted. Every military person in the room followed suit. Sarah returned the salute, her hand steady, her eyes clear. She thought about the girl she'd been when she first enlisted, young, uncertain, desperate to prove herself. She thought about the nurse who'd arrived at Riverside Memorial weeks ago, hoping to disappear into quiet obscurity. She was neither of those people anymore. Dr. Michaels approached the podium next. "On behalf of Riverside Memorial Hospital, I want to publicly acknowledge that we failed Ms. Bennett. We created an environment where speaking truth to power resulted in punishment instead of recognition. That ends today." She turned to face Sarah directly. "Effective immediately, Sarah Bennett is our new Director of Trauma Services. She has full authority to reform our department, implement new protocols, and ensure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else in this institution." More applause. Amy was crying openly. Even some of the physicians who'd dismissed Sarah weeks ago were clapping, though several looked uncomfortable. The ceremony concluded with remarks from Agent Morse about the ongoing federal investigation and the successful dismantling of the conspiracy. Patricia had provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. Renner and Voss were facing charges that would likely mean decades in prison. The pharmaceutical companies involved were under investigation. Justice, Sarah thought, looked different than she'd imagined. Messier, more complicated, but real. As people filed out of the conference room, Holloway appeared in the doorway. He was in a wheelchair, still too weak to walk far, but he'd insisted on attending. Sarah approached him. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Yes, I did." Holloway looked at the medal on her collar. "I needed to see this, needed to witness what accountability looks like." He paused. "The board offered me the teaching position. I accepted. I start when I'm cleared medically." "Good. I won't let you down." Sarah studied the man who'd been her enemy and was now something else. Not quite an ally, but maybe a work in progress. Don't let yourself down. That's what matters. That evening, Sarah stood in the emergency department she now oversaw, watching the organized chaos of a Friday night shift. Ambulances arriving, nurses triaging patients, residents managing cases under her supervision. Martinez found her there. "Colonel wanted me to give you this," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on military stationery. Sarah read it twice, her throat tight. "Sergeant Bennett, you saved my life, but more importantly, you reminded me why we serve. Not for glory or recognition, but because some things matter more than our own comfort or safety. The research I was doing, the protocols you helped protect, will save countless lives in combat zones around the world. You didn't just save one colonel. You saved every soldier who'll benefit from that work. I'm recommending you for additional recognition at the Pentagon. I'm also making sure your story reaches the people who train our combat medics so they understand what it means to have moral courage under fire. You left the military, but the military will never leave you. You carry it in every decision you make, every stand you take. That's not a burden, it's a superpower. Thank you for your service. All of it, Colonel James Mitchell." Sarah folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Through the emergency department windows, she could see Crescent Falls at night, city lights stretching toward the horizon, lives being lived in homes and streets and buildings, all of them potential patients who might one day need this hospital. Her hospital now. Her responsibility. Her chance to build something better. Amy appeared at her elbow. "Director Bennett, we've got a multi-vehicle collision coming in. ETA, 2 minutes. You want to take lead?" Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharpening of focus that came before controlled chaos. But this time, when she walked toward the trauma bay, she wasn't the invisible nurse hoping to stay unnoticed. She was the director, the leader, the person who'd fought her way from the bottom to the top and refused to become what she'd defeated. "Let's show them how it's done," Sarah said. The ambulances arrived right on schedule. Sarah directed her team with calm authority, coordinating care across multiple patients, making decisions that saved lives and prevented complications. The residents watched her work with respect. The nurses followed her lead without hesitation. Even the attending physicians deferred to her judgment on complex trauma cases. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd almost lost, everything she'd proven she deserved. But as the last patient was stabilized and transferred to surgery, as Sarah was stripping off bloodied gloves and documenting the cases, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, almost deleted it without reading. But something made her open it. The message was brief. "Congratulations on your promotion, Director Bennett. The colonel survived, the conspiracy was exposed, and you won. But did you ever wonder why Patricia was so easy to catch? Why the evidence was so convenient? Why everything wrapped up so neatly? Some of us are still watching, some of us are still waiting, and the next move is going to be much harder to see coming." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she read it again. Then again. She immediately called Morse, but it went to voicemail. She tried Martinez. Same result. The number that sent the message was already disconnected when she tried to call back. Sarah stood alone in the trauma bay, medal still pinned to her collar, director title freshly minted, surrounded by the evidence of her victory. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, she wondered if she'd actually won anything at all, or if she'd just survived the opening move in a much longer game. Sarah stared at the threatening message for exactly 10 seconds before her training overrode her fear. She screenshotted it, forwarded it to Morse's secure email, then locked her phone and walked directly to hospital security. "I need the surveillance footage from the emergency department for the last 2 hours, she told the head of security, a former cop named Davis. "And I need every phone that accessed the hospital's internal network during my ceremony. Someone sent me a threat, and they're either inside this building or they've breached our systems." Davis didn't question her authority. Within 20 minutes, Sarah was reviewing footage alongside federal agents who'd been stationed at the hospital. They tracked every person who'd entered the building, cross-referenced phone signals, analyzed network access logs. The trace led to a burner phone that had connected briefly to the hospital's guest Wi-Fi, sending one message before disconnecting permanently. But the physical location data pointed to somewhere inside Riverside Memorial during the transmission. "Whoever sent this was here," Morse said, when he arrived 30 minutes later, his expression grim. "Watching you, testing to see if you'd panic." "I'm not panicking," Sarah said. "I'm hunting." They found the answer in security footage from the conference room where the ceremony had taken place. A figure in maintenance coveralls had entered during the event, ostensibly to check the air conditioning. But the angle of their body, the way they'd positioned themselves near the door, they'd been watching, listening. The maintenance worker had signed in as J. Torres, but when security checked the actual maintenance roster, no one by that name was scheduled for that shift. "They wanted you to know," Martinez said, reviewing the footage. "Wanted you to understand this isn't over. It's psychological warfare." Sarah thought about Patricia, about the convenient evidence, about how neatly everything had wrapped up. They sacrificed Patricia and the others, used them as decoys while the real operation stayed hidden. "That's the theory we're working on now," Morse confirmed. "The pharmaceutical companies we arrested were small players. The real money, the real power, we haven't found it yet. And whoever's running this operation knows you're the one person who can't be bought or scared into silence." "So what do they want?" Morse met her eyes. "They want you to make a mistake, to get paranoid, to overreach, to give them a reason to discredit you. They couldn't destroy you through Holloway, couldn't kill you through direct attack. So now they're trying to make you destroy yourself. Sarah felt something click into place. The message wasn't just a threat, it was bait. They wanted her afraid, wanted her looking over her shoulder, wanted her to become the paranoid conspiracy theorist instead of the credible director who'd exposed corruption. "Then I won't give them what they want," she said. Over the next week, Sarah did exactly what the message's author didn't expect. She ignored the threat and focused on her actual job. She implemented new trauma protocols. She held staff meetings where nurses and residents could voice concerns without fear. She worked with the hospital board to create independent oversight committees. And she waited. The break came from an unexpected source. Holloway, now teaching residents about clinical humility and collaborative care, noticed something odd in the hospital's supply chain records. Certain medications were being ordered in quantities that didn't match usage patterns. "I almost missed it," he told Sarah when he brought her the data. "But when you spend years micromanaging every aspect of a department, you notice when numbers don't add up." Sarah reviewed the records and saw what Holloway had found. Someone was systematically diverting controlled substances, not enough to trigger automatic alerts, but consistent enough to indicate organized theft. She brought the evidence to Morse, who brought in the DEA. Within 48 hours, they traced the diversion to a network that connected back to the same pharmaceutical interests that had targeted Colonel Mitchell. The scheme was elegant and massive. Steal medications from hospitals, create artificial shortages, drive up prices, and profit from the chaos. Patricia's involvement had been real, but minor. The assassination attempt on the colonel had been about silencing his research that could have exposed the broader fraud. And the person coordinating it all from inside Riverside Memorial was someone Sarah had never suspected, Dr. Sandra Michaels, the board chair who'd apologized so eloquently, who'd offered Sarah the directorship, who'd positioned herself as the champion of reform. "She played us perfectly," Morse said during the arrest briefing, sacrificed her subordinates, positioned herself as the solution, and used the investigation to consolidate power while we were looking elsewhere. Sarah felt sick. She'd trusted Michaels, had believed the apology, the commitment to change. "The message you received," Morse continued, "we traced it to her personal phone. She sent it to gauge your reaction, to see if you'd become unstable enough to discredit. When you didn't take the bait, she probably realized you were more dangerous than she'd calculated." The arrest happened publicly, in the hospital lobby during morning rounds. Federal agents walked Sandra Michaels out in handcuffs while staff and patients watched in stunned silence. The evidence was overwhelming: communication records, financial transfers, testimony from co-conspirators trying to reduce their sentences. The board chair who'd promised accountability was led away facing charges that would mean life in prison. Sarah watched from the emergency department entrance, feeling not triumph, but exhaustion. How many layers did corruption have? How many times would she have to fight the same battle? "You okay?" Amy asked, appearing at her side. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I thought we'd won. Thought the ceremony and the reforms meant something. Now I find out the person who gave me this job was using me as cover for continued criminal activity." Amy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But we did win. Look around." Sarah looked. She saw nurses confidently voicing concerns about patient care. Saw residents asking questions instead of blindly following orders. Saw a culture that had begun shifting toward transparency and collaboration. "Michaels gave you the directorship to control you," Amy continued, "but you actually did the job. You made real changes. You built something she couldn't manipulate or destroy. That's what matters." The hospital board, now down to emergency leadership, met with Sarah that afternoon. The interim chair was Dr. Robert Hayes, a surgeon who'd been vocal about supporting reforms. "Ms. Bennett, we owe you another apology," he began. "Stop apologizing and start fixing the system," Sarah interrupted. "I don't want apologies. I want structural changes that make it impossible for one person to have the kind of power Michaels had. I want transparency, oversight, and consequences for people who abuse their positions." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then help us build that. Your directorship stands. In fact, we'd like to expand it. Director of Quality and Safety for the entire hospital, not just trauma. You'd have authority to investigate any concerns anywhere in the institution." Sarah thought about accepting another promotion from a board that had failed twice to protect its patients. Thought about walking away from all of it, finding somewhere quieter, somewhere safer. But she also thought about the message Amy had shown her that morning, A thank you note from the young woman who'd survived the mass casualty event because Sarah had pushed for the FAST exam. The patient Holloway had almost killed through stubbornness and pride. That woman was alive because Sarah had refused to stay quiet. How many others could benefit from someone who wouldn't back down? "I'll take the position," Sarah said, "on one condition. Every decision I make, every change I implement gets published in monthly public reports. No more closed-door deals, no more hidden corruption, complete transparency." "Agreed," Hayes said. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same conference room where she'd received her medal, but this time the gathering was different. Hospital staff from every department filled the space: nurses, physicians, technicians, administrators, even housekeeping and cafeteria workers. "We're here to launch the Riverside Accountability Initiative," Sarah said, addressing the crowd. "Every employee, regardless of position, will have direct access to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Every complaint will be investigated by an independent committee. Every outcome will be published publicly." She paused, looking at the faces in front of her. Some skeptical, some hopeful, all of them watching to see if this would be real change or just another empty promise. "I know trust has to be earned," Sarah continued. "I know words are easy and action is hard. But I also know what it feels like to be silenced, to be dismissed, to be told you don't matter. I will not let that happen to anyone else in this hospital. That's not a promise. It's a commitment I'm making in front of all of you, and you have the power to hold me to it." After the meeting, Sarah found Holloway waiting in the hallway. He looked healthier now, the color back in his face, though he still moved carefully. "That was a good speech," he said. "It wasn't a speech. It was a declaration." Holloway smiled, not the arrogant smirk she remembered, but something more genuine. "I'm teaching a session next week on the danger of medical hierarchy and ego. I'd like you to co-present. Show the residents what collaborative care actually looks like." Sarah considered refusing, then realized this was exactly the kind of partnership that could change the culture. A nurse and a doctor, former enemies, modeling mutual respect. "I'll be there," she said. That evening, Sarah received one final message, this time from Colonel Mitchell. "Heard about Michaels? You caught another one. When are you going to run out of conspiracies to expose?" She typed back, "Hopefully soon. I'd like to just practice medicine for a while." The response came immediately. "You're doing more than practicing medicine. You're showing people what integrity looks like under pressure. That matters more than you know." Sarah set her phone down and looked around her office, the director's office that she'd earned through skill and courage, not politics or connections. On her desk sat the medal Mitchell had given her. On the wall hung a framed copy of Amy's petition with all 43 signatures. And in her email inbox was a message from a nursing student who'd heard her story and wanted to know how to stand up to authority without losing her career. Sarah began typing a response, and as she wrote, she realized something. The fight wasn't over. It would probably never be over. There would always be people who prioritized profit over patience, ego over expertise, power over principle. But there would also always be people willing to stand against them. People like Amy, like Martinez, like the 43 who'd signed their names to demand better. Like Holloway learning to be more than his worst impulses. Like every nurse who'd ever been told to stay in their lane and had the courage to step out of it anyway. Sarah had spent years trying to be invisible, trying to escape her past, trying to avoid conflict. And in the end, it was visibility, the willingness to be seen, to be challenged, to be targeted, that had given her real power. Not the power to hide, the power to change things. She finished the email to the student and hit send. Then she packed up her things and headed home, walking through Riverside Memorial's hallways with her head up and her shoulders back. The hospital was different now, not perfect. It would never be perfect. But better, safer, more honest. And if threats came, if conspiracies emerged, if someone tried to drag her back into the shadows, well, she'd already proven she knew how to fight in the light. Sarah Bennett had been underestimated her entire career, had been dismissed, silenced, nearly destroyed. But she'd also been forged in places where weakness meant death, and strength meant keeping someone alive for one more minute, one more hour, one more day. They'd never see her coming again, and that was exactly how she wanted it.